Soundscape horror.
Daughter in the Mirror by Richard L. Elsliger. The last time I saw my daughter, she was 9 months old. She was taken from my abode with the false promise of return. That was 18 years ago. My daughter arrived at the airport on a sweltering Sunday afternoon. Her flight from Copenhagen, Denmark, had been delayed, which added to a low, roiling tension at seeing her for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Why, you might ask, did so much time pass between us, with no contact, and you would be just in asking such a question? Suffice it to say that a conspiracy of factors kept us apart, both by natural geography and, without casting fault or downright guilt on other parties to the equation, there were human elements to blame, shall I say. Such elements I was unable to overcome, though it was not for want of trying. Phone calls to check on my daughter became hang-ups, and then evolved to no answer at all. It tortured me to know that my daughter, by gradual increments, was slipping away, leaving my life forever. At some point, I was admonished by the family never to call again, so I had to let go and continue my own life in Chicago without her. Oh, how foul that circumstance to have a daughter ripped from one's life, and it stung in the most wretched of ways. For years I suffered, not knowing her state of being, her triumphs and failures at school, if indeed there were failures, for my daughter is a very intelligent girl. I sensed her erudite radiance from the moment we met at the terminal. I harbored many ill feelings to the powers that caused this tragedy, both human and geographical, and I often questioned the unforgivable theft of time that could never be repaid. As I prefaced earlier, I do not wish to cast aspersions on others for the theft of time, but such time can never be recaptured for all the money in the world. That time remains forever gone, irretrievable. I foolishly asked Elise for her papers, attempting in the most pathetic of ways to alleviate the nervousness experienced by us both. She shed some tears and hugged me, serving as her best response, a most fitting response for such a long passage of time. I directed her to the elevator that opened to the glass pedway and parking lot. She demonstrated efficiency, my first notable impression, carrying a large but solitary and sleek luggage piece. We engaged in small talk about the horrid heat of the day, and she slyly suggested that perhaps she should have stayed in Europe. I responded by asking if she could take me with her. She smiled, and I could see in that smile elements of my own features and a few haunting elements from my mother, an Icelandic beauty from the past, now long committed to this earth. I rolled the windows down in my old faithful Lincoln, but I could see that the sudden exposure to the humid climes of the Midwest might melt this fair maiden from the north. I mentioned to her that my car was on life support, but I would take the chance and try the air conditioner, which hadn't been used in several years. I rolled up the windows and turned the air to full. Much to my shock, we began to receive strong Arctic blasts from the vents. Loyal Lincoln, I thought, after all the battle scars endured from years of driving the rough roads of Chicago, she still came through. Elise thanked me and we drove on. She expressed an immediate desire to see one of America's generic shopping outlets, and I indulged her by navigating our way to the largest store I could find. She took a shopping cart and branched off, giving me the impression that she wished to explore on her own. She went in one direction, I in another. Our first shopping experience together in one way and separate in yet another. We proceeded through the checkout with our purchases, mine a marble toothbrush holder that I still own to this day. Hers was the most exquisite silver mirror I'd ever laid eyes upon. The reflective propensities astounded me, and I asked her where she found it. Elise responded that it was the last one on the shelf, over in bathroom accessories. The mirror felt weighty, and the translucent post looked more like fine bohemian crystal than tawdry plastic. Somehow the mirror looked very antiquated, an old thing that had no business being in this store. Great find, I said, and we left. My daughter expressed a keen interest to occupy my finished basement, an insistence that unsettled me. We had discussed accommodations throughout various emails and text messages over the last year while getting to know each other on a virtual level, but messaging never proved to be an acceptable substitute to actually seeing the place. I thought the basement apartment to be a bad idea. Basements were the harbingers of darkness and negative vibrations, eerie phenomena that could never be extricated from their static nature. As further argument in support of my opposition, I submitted that basements were crypts. In my mind, anything underground broadcasted notions of death. For where did people go when the body gave up but beneath the earth, as humans had done for millennia, cremation being the exception, and oftentimes the cremated were buried as well. Some traditions die hard. I acceded to her request, and she mapped out the basement apartment as her own. Elise, the strategist, I considered, for she had ordered her own furniture and bed ahead of her arrival in Chicago. I took delight in assembling the bed along with a few select pieces to complement the surroundings before she arrived. She admonished that I refrain from further piecing together her furniture, as she demonstrated a mechanical inclination, and she wished to execute on building her own furniture. When we arrived home, I let her be while I busied myself in the kitchen. I could hear the rustling of activity in my basement, and it delighted me to know that my daughter had come back to me. A few hours later, she came up to the main floor and advised that she wanted to retire to sleep, and I acknowledged, advising that jet lag was a real thing. For the next several days, Elise would come upstairs, but expressly for the limited purpose of making something to eat. She refused to eat in my presence, an idiosyncrasy that I attributed to the unfamiliarity of knowing her own father. I let it be, and while she entertained herself down below, I entertained myself above, playing the Steinway, running through the greats such as Chopin, Beethoven, and Rachmaninoff. At no time did Elise come to the living room to hear me play, preferring to remain within the cool confines of the basement. Summer still raged in its stifling heat, and I attributed this desire to remain below as a means of escaping the broiling August temperatures, although I had more than adequate central air throughout the house. But such temperatures were not for long, and September arrived with no corresponding adjustment in her approach to me. She stayed downstairs for incredibly long spans of time, and on occasion, I felt the need to open the door and shout down the steps if everything was okay. In the dark, she would respond in the affirmative. Her preferred method of communication existed through the phone, a peculiar idea since at any given time we were not more than shouting distance from our respective domains. I never contributed to or made her feel in any way unwelcome on the main floor. In fact, I had offered her the third bedroom over the basement. She politely declined the main floor bedroom in favor of the dungeon below. I gave her use of the Lincoln, providing her with an ignition key as well as a key to the house and garage, and the freedom to come and go as she pleased. I did not wish to appear stifling. There came a moment where I believed that a more meaningful communication might erupt, and that moment arrived when I broke out the limited production Mustang I stored in my garage. She heard the car before she saw it, the rumbling exhaust drawing her to the surface. She opened the side door, and I asked her what she thought. She lavished praise upon the car, and I asked her if she wanted to go for a drive. I detected hesitancy in her eyes, and I said, "Come on," with some insistence. She jumped in, and we drove the neighborhood, and then, without warning, I pulled over to the curb and suggested she drive. Her face lit up like a bonfire for the first time at the prospect. She drove along streets and boulevards, not realizing the car's full potential, but her absolute joy at driving such a high horsepower beast was readily apparent on her face. That made me happy as well. When we returned, I parked the car, and Elise retreated to the basement once more. She was downstairs before I could get through the door. What a strange situation, but I endured, believing that with time this behavior would change, and a thawing of the ice floe between us would, in the end, be realized. Seeing her interest in fast cars, I suggested we drive up to Road America in Wisconsin, a well-known racetrack going back to the 1950s. I thought this might be a great time to spend a Saturday together, bonding as father and daughter. Since our communication seemed limited to texting, I sent the message to her awaiting a reply. A half hour later, she indicated that she had to work that day at a babysitting job she'd acquired in the first few weeks of her stay. That sounded like a legitimate reason, so I made a counter that we could go Sunday, since the event lasted 2 days. That was met quickly with a no thank you. That is my best recollection of the exchange. My memory not so good now, for the event happened so long ago. It hurt to read the response at the time, and still hurts when I think about it today. Undaunted, I pressed on, waiting and watching to see what direction we might go in the relationship that had yet to grow any roots. I knew that some plants grew at quicker rates than others, and yet other plants, such as orchids, were delicate species that required the utmost nurturing. The days flew by and turned into weeks. Soon Halloween was upon us, and I offered to take her to the pumpkin farm west of me. Naturally, she kept herself sequestered away from my presence at every available opportunity, and I did not wish to press the issue, and utilized her preferred standard of communication by messaging Elise while she remained downstairs. To this message I received no answer. My invitation went invariably into the void. From time to time, whole days went by without seeing each other. One day I heard loud clanging downstairs, suggestive of metal-on-metal contact. I attributed the noise to Elise putting together a coat rack, as revealed by the empty box on the kitchen floor. I jokingly sent her a message asking whether she was building an alien ship down there, to which I received no response. It stung me like a scorpion to see the continued downfall of this father-daughter relationship, powerless to change its course. I began to question the purpose of her visit, not knowing the methodology of her true intent. At least she was here, and for that I was grateful. Thanksgiving came and went, Elise choosing to spend her time with a new friend she'd met in the area. Over the decades, I'd grown accustomed to eating alone during these special occasions, giving pause to reflect on my life and the choices I'd made. Her birthday came up rather fast, turning 19 years of age. That birthday was spent in absentia, my daughter choosing to spend the time with this newly acquired friend. I wished her happy birthday by text, and it was met with a very curt response. I'd planned for her birthday ahead of time, having bought a modest gift, a sterling silver Route 66 charm, along with a birthday card. She collected the gift and card outside of my presence when she came back to the house to gather more of her belongings. By gradations, she was moving away from me, leaving orbit toward another galaxy, reducing any chance to normalize life between us. I think about the charm I gave on her birthday, and did my best to conjure a mental image of her reaction. Maybe she kept the charm, or maybe she threw it out. What became of the gift is beyond the scope of my knowledge as I sit here and recall these events from long ago. Gradually her messaging devolved from one-word answers and morphed into illustrated symbols of the time, such as the thumbs-up emoji, as they were called. I suppose I should have been thankful that I was not awarded the thumbs down during these terse communications. Christmas came and went without her presence, and by this time Elise had all but moved out to live with her new friend. She left some clothes in her suitcase behind, which gave me some reassurance that she would return one day. I never learned a singular detail about her friend, who they were and where they lived. I watched on, a disembodied observer, while the door between Elise and I began to close, and I knew before long that door would be shut. That day inevitably arrived when I drove home from work and pulled into the driveway. I walked in through the side door expecting the usual silence, for Elise had chosen a new residence away from her father. She had her reasons, of that I am certain, though these reasons were never stated, and I was left to guess. Elise never dropped by anymore, the exception being one, maybe two times, when she moved more of her belongings. Days and sometimes weeks flew into the intangible void, where we never saw each other, never communicated, and that affected me in the most profound of ways. I will not forget that late afternoon when I arrived home. I had decided to make it a laundry night. I gathered the hamper and walked down the steps. I clicked on the light, still expecting to see her luggage and a few remaining clothes, but this time everything was gone, everything except her furniture and one silver mirror, the mirror she'd bought at the store. A cold and desolate feeling crept into my bones. My daughter had vanished from my life once more, yet I still held out hope. I searched for a note, an explanation, but found none. I checked my phone for messages, the display devoid of any communication from Elise. I sent a message asking about her current condition, whether she was okay. I received a cursory message that she'd returned back to Copenhagen. I did not know when or if she would ever be back. Reading those words broke my heart as a father, and I felt emotions coursing through me that I'd never known possible. I looked at the silver mirror. Reflected in that mirror, I saw Elise's face looking back at me, smiling. I thought it a grand hallucination at the time, and maybe it was. I removed the mirror from the basement and placed it on the Steinway upstairs, and that is where her mirror stayed. I still play and compose on occasion, and when I gaze into the mirror, I see Elise every time. My father once told me that mirrors help you see things you cannot normally see. I never heard from Elise again. Through the decades since she left, I watched her life overseas reflected back at me. I saw her life change. I saw her marry. I saw her children, and on occasion, when I peered into the reflection long enough, she would smile at me. I took empty consolation in this mirror, watching my daughter's life change from afar, but I also wondered if she'd left the mirror for a purpose. Decades have passed, and still I possess this strange mirror that allows me to see my daughter from afar. I do not know where she is, other than I suspect she lives somewhere in Denmark, judging by the many images of her conveyed to me through this mirror. Our communication has long since perished. Her number became disconnected and her address unlisted. All I have to remember my Elise is this mirror, and I am thankful for this gift. One day I woke up to find myself in my late 80s. It was a Sunday in August that I walked to the living room with the intention of playing the old Steinway, the only thing other than the mirror that stayed with me throughout the years. That is when I noticed that the mirror had fallen for reasons unknown. A shock went through me. I rushed to the mirror and picked it up by the post and watched the many fragments fall and scatter across the hardwood. I gathered them up piece by piece, tears streaming down my face. I cradled the fragments in my hands, cognizant of the implication behind this cruel circumstance. It was then that I knew my relationship with my daughter would forever be broken. I put the mirror aside and began to play, my flowing tears staining the Steinway's keys while I played the piece I wrote and dedicated to her many years ago, a piece I called Elisa's Song. It is unmanly for me to cry, yet I weep for the shattered mirror, the only tangible remaining connection with my daughter and the relationship that would never be. I stopped playing and walked back to the mirror, studying the individual fragments, seeking any trace of Elise. The broken mirror no longer reflected my daughter, and none of its individual pieces could bring her back to me. It was then that I came to realize that sometimes bad dreams do come true.